guidebook. And I've yet to hear somebody having gone to all 50, but I would love to see somebody having been able to get to all 50 in the next year or two. Okay, so let's start with the buildings. I'm going to go ahead and go through the next four. We're going to start with the JP properties. And this is one of these kind of hidden pieces of, I think, Boston's history that is kind of hiding in plain sight. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about coincidences. The two buildings in Jamaica Plain are numbers 23 and number 24 in the book. And I think it's just great that the essentially neighboring houses are more or less the same date and ended up in sequential order in the book when I did all the dates and added them all up, which is just, that was a nice coincidence. I'm going to focus on four buildings that are connected to each other. So as we go through, you're going to see kind of the interconnectedness of a lot of these properties and how they relate to each other. Because one of the takeaway messages I got from writing this book was that essentially Boston is a really small town with not that many people in the 18th and 17th centuries. And so we keep seeing the same cast of characters turning up in the same locations over the course of the book, which is, I think, fun. Okay. So in 1755, the merchant John Gould paid for the construction of a large home for his daughter Sarah and her future husband, the Reverend John Troutbeck, on a large parcel on Center Street. This was later called Linden Hall. Troutbeck was the assistant rector of King's Chapel. We're going to talk about King's Chapel tonight as one of those connected buildings. He was also a distiller, and which was a profession that was frowned upon by some members of the community, including the author of the following poem. So it's one of these kind of conflict of interest where you have both a member of the church hierarchy and a distiller. And this is a poem that was written about that kind of clashing priorities. So John of small merit, who deals in the spirit, as next in course I sing, fame would I treat, as is most meet, this chaplain of the king. His Sunday aim is to reclaim those that in vice are sunk. When Mondays came, he selleth rum and gets them plaguey drunk. So that was a period poem about the original head of household for this house in JP and his kind of conflicting priorities. So like many of the buildings in this book, Troutbeck's home, later Linden Hall, was moved to save it from demolition. It once stood near the southwest corner of Center and Pond Streets, with grounds extending far back onto Jamaica Pond. In its original setting, the house was just 2 stories tall and had a hipped roof and end chimneys, with 2 large wings on either side, creating a monumental structure. The estate featured an expansive lawn all the way down to Jamaica Pond and was known to have a large linden trees along its walk to its entrance, giving it the name Linden Hall. This is a photo of it in its original location prior to its move, and you can see some of the linden trees growing around it. Jamaica Pond is one of the few natural ponds in Boston. Its size, coupled with its ideal distance from Boston, not too close but also not too far away, provided an ideal setting for wealthy residents to build large estates along its shores. Though the individual properties have shrunk in size over the years, some of the largest homes in Boston can still be found around Jamaica Pond. In this image, the 2 stars represent the original location of Linden Hall, which you can see at the blue star, and the yellow star is its current location where it was moved back from the main street. So Center Street runs left to right on the image, and Linden Hall is on the corner of Center and Pond originally, and the yard would have extended directly back from Linden Hall all the way down to Jamaica Pond, which now there's a couple of dozen buildings already built up at this point. But a lot of these major homes were located closer to kind of the main street of Jamaica Plain, with these large backyards that extended down to Jamaica Pond. Today, the buildings are kind of more built up around Jamaica Pond, but those were essentially the backyards of these larger estates back then. In 1776, Troutbeck and his wife, both Tories, abandoned the property and fled the city of Boston. After the Revolution, a third story was added to the building, and it was converted into the Charles W. Green Academy, a college preparatory school for boys. In 1840, a dancing school was established in the building, which indicates the overall scale of the rooms inside of the large mansion. I wasn't able to include either of these images in the book because of the the rights issues, but I wanted to include them in the presentation today because it shows not just the front of the building before it was moved when it was being used for the academy, but this great drawing on the right that actually shows the back of the building, which you never get to see in historic images, of how the backs of these buildings extended out and all the additions onto the building as well. And you can almost make out the privy. I think there's a little addition on the back of the building that I think may have been the outhouse, which I would love to dig someday, but the chances are there's a pretty big building on top of it by now. So the city laid out Grosvenor Road in 1890 just behind Linden Hall. And between 1896 and 1905, the mansion was moved to make way for structures. I don't know the exact date. I'm using those as two maps dated to those time periods that show it in its location, the original location, and its later moved location. The mansion was moved to make way for structures built closer to the street. This early 20th century image shows this corner, center, and Pond Streets where the building once stood. Just to the left is the view here. If you go by the corner of Pond and Center Streets today, the building on the left is still standing. I haven't checked out if all the other buildings are still standing, but definitely the one on the left is still there. So after the move, Linden Hall was converted into apartments. Linden Hall is not a city landmark, but it is listed on the National Register as a contributing property to Monument Square Historic District. Though the interior of the structure has been broken up and the windows replaced and vinyl siding added, the property is one of the few surviving grand early homes around Jamaica Pond. Importantly, Linden Hall is not a museum, but remains a home to Bostonians, the original purpose for which it was built. So even though Linden Hall has lost a lot of its visual impact, both in its location and its overall structure, it's still fundamentally a functional piece of a functional home for the people of JP. And I think that's really an important takeaway because a lot of these buildings have changed purpose over time, and many have been adaptively reused or been converted into museums. And I think it's important that one of the ways that we keep historic homes preserved is to keep them used as historic homes and keep people living in them. Nothing against places that have been turned into public space or museums, but it is a viable option to break these up into smaller apartments and condos in order to preserve them. Even though we may have a massive building, it doesn't need to be kept as a single family, especially in a growing city. And that's what happened to Linden Hall. And we can actually probably thank that for the reason that it's still standing, is this kind of move it into a more dense location and break it up into smaller living units. All right, so we're going to move on to the next building in the book and its neighbor, the Loring Greenough House, built in 1760, the 24th oldest building in Boston. So unlike Linden Hall, located just down the road, this stately home retains not only its overall historic appearance, but also some of its original setting. The home was built for Commodore Joshua Loring, a commander of the English forces on the Great Lakes during the 7 Years' War. After a distinguished military career, he chose to retire to a farm in West Roxbury, now Jamaica Plain. He purchased the farm estate in 1752 and had the third church parsonage that stood there removed, and had workers begin the construction of a large home. The above drawing supposedly shows the parsonage as it appeared before it was moved. So it's directly above the arrow. But the drawing may not be accurate. We're not entirely sure. So the house on the right is located currently on McBride Street in Jamaica Plain and is said to be the parsonage shown on the left. Personally, I'm a little bit dubious, but we're still in the process of looking at this property to see if it could actually have been a highly modified version of the original parsonage. If that is the case, we will be adding this book to the 50 oldest and bump off the youngest book in the youngest building in the book, number 50, which is currently in Charlestown, which will put it as the third building in Jamaica Plain. If it is, it's been heavily modified from the original drawing, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And there's plenty of modified buildings in this book that have still kept their title of oldest buildings in Boston. Loring's house is a tall, square building with 2.5 stories, 5 bays on each side, and bays are opening, so that can be windows or doors, and a Georgian-style hipped roof. The Chinese Chippendale-style latticework railing along the roofline is original and reflects the owner's high-end design tastes. I actually see in archaeological sites that same or similar lattice pattern around the roof of the Loring Greenough house, represented in Chinese porcelain and other ceramics that are actually meant to kind of mimic Chinese style, painted as borders around plates and dishes. And we see Chinese porcelain on archaeological sites as the kind of highest level sign of wealth. Very few people could actually afford Chinese porcelain, and in this case, seeing that same style on the roof of a house is really Loring is really basically saying I'm extremely wealthy. If you couldn't tell from the size and the scale of this house, you could definitely tell from some of the additional little design elements to be added, including this Chinese reference at the top. So the house's two original 18th century doors would have been located on the north or the garden side showed here, or the south, which is the parking lot area side of the home. Each are massive 12-panel doors, meaning there are 12 flat areas within the design of the door, making them extremely wide and grand, as was typical of elite houses in the Georgian period. One of the differences between Georgian and later federal style buildings, there's not a lot of visual difference, but one of the bigger differences is that Georgians tend to be a little bit wider and a little bit grand in the width sense, and federals tend to be grand in height sense and thinness. So a Georgian house tends to be just a little squatter than a federal home, which is a little bit more like a squeezed in version of a Georgian. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's how I interpret it. The north door was moved to the newer west side entrance facing Center Street, which you can see on the right side of this image, and replaced with a smaller federal door in the 19th century, using sidelight windows to fill in the gaps on either side of the now smaller door, which you can just make out on the left image, at the left doorway in the image by the stairs. The carriage house connected to the east end of the mansion, which also contains the last existing summer kitchen in Boston. Summer kitchens are basically kitchens located on the outside of a building or on the back of a building, essentially to keep the heat from a summer cooking away from the main part of the building, because it would basically heat up an already hot house. So summer kitchens are kitchens that are on the back or outside. You may also find regular kitchens inside these houses at the same time. Some of them only had a summer kitchen. In the South, you sometimes see kitchens in entirely separate buildings. If you go to the Royal House in Medford, which has slave quarters on the property, the kitchen's actually in that separate building with the slave quarters. So a lot of these kind of grand mansions that have an estate around them, you get to see these kind of changes in the landscape and these different uses of buildings on the landscape where they survive. And this is one of those rare surviving examples. So earlier maps of this area shows that there were multiple outbuildings, including a barn on the east side of the house, which has since been lost to development. Though much of the original estate has been developed, the house remains inside a relatively large parcel, which is a map drawing of the parcel in the 1940s. And this helps maintain the overall appearance of this grand Georgian home within a rural setting, much as it was in the 18th century. So if you drive by this house, it's very clearly in a open space that's very different from many of the buildings in this book that were built in these large open areas that have kind of either lost those open areas or the houses have been moved into a much more urban setting like Linden Hall that you saw earlier. Loring and his family were Tories, like the Troutbacks, and fled during the Revolution. For 4 weeks starting in June 3rd, 1775, the rebel General Nathaniel Greene used this house as a headquarters and a hospital for people wounded during the fighting nearby. As a result, the Loring Greenough House has been designated a National Medical Landmark by the American Association for the History of Medicine. The dead were buried nearby in an area that was once part of the large estate, but were later exhumed and moved into Peters Hill Cemetery, now in Arnold Arboretum. Peters Hill has a small graveyard behind it if you've been there. In 1783, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts sold the home to Anne Doan. So one of the things that we see in the deeds is that after the Tories fled, the properties that the Tories owned were essentially seized by the state. And after the war and the foundations of the various states, we actually see the Commonwealth of Massachusetts itself selling off these properties that were owned by Tories. And actually the deed in 1783 is Massachusetts selling the Loring estate. So they sold it to Anne Doan, a widow and wealthy heiress. She married David Stoddard Greenough, a society lawyer who had represented her late husband 3 months later, and their family remained in the home for 5 generations. In 1907, the house was modernized, adding plumbing and new floors to portions of the building before the family put the house on the market in 1924. So plumbing wasn't added to the building until the early 1900s, despite it being available in the area for about 30 years at that point. So that's one of the things we see in these older houses, that they're a little bit slower to pick up on some of the new additional technology, depending on if it's an older family living in the property. So meanwhile, in the early 20th century, the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club, a women's organization, was formed in 1896. In the 19th century, there were popular men's clubs in Boston named for every evening in the week, except for Tuesdays and Sundays. So the women, when they named their organization, had a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek and decided to name their group the Tuesday Club. Design plans for a row of three-deckers and stores on the house's property were already in existence when the Tuesday Club decided to purchase the house from a group of developers and convert the house into its headquarters. The image above shows the members of the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club on the west porch of the Loring Greenough House around 1927. So it's really important to me throughout the book. One of the things that I had a problem with in similar style books where they go through the history of a building era or of a region. One was that they looked at the nicest houses and the oldest houses and the coolest stories of an area, and they didn't necessarily look at all the oldest buildings. So some of the older books in Boston that go into old houses in Boston, especially in the 20th and 19th centuries, will pick and choose which ones they want to talk about. It may not be the oldest ones, but just the ones that look the nicest. So it was important to me to actually do the first 50, regardless of what they look like, regardless of their history, and really focus on what's the interesting story about these buildings, excuse me. The other thing that really bothers me with a lot of these buildings and a lot of these histories is that they really focus on the folks that have the most written history. And without many exceptions in the history of this country, we have a challenge doing history where the folks that are the least recorded in written documents are folks like women, children, minorities, enslaved people, folks that are just not writing history or not writing about themselves or not having other people writing about them. And it's one of the reasons why I like archaeology, is that you get some of these underrepresented histories of women, children, minorities, enslaved people, immigrant populations, because their stuff is in the ground just like everyone else's is. So one of my goals in this book was to focus on not just what I call the old dead white guy history, but also the stories of women, children, and enslaved people and minorities and immigrants in the book. And I wanted to do that also visually. So I deliberately chose to not include photographs of white men in the book, with one exception, because the Deloy Thomas house in Roxbury, there's a great photograph of Mr. Thomas sitting on in a group setting of 4 Japanese students that came to America as the first exchange education program with Japan in the 1800s. They actually lived in the Deloy Thomas house in Roxbury. And there's this fantastic photo of these 19th century young men from Japan standing around Mr. Thomas in a photograph. And so he's the guy who gets photographed in the book. And I love this photograph because it really captures the importance of the women that were involved in the saving of this house, the running of this organization, and their passion for historic preservation that ultimately led to this building being saved. And it's also just a fantastic photograph. And thank you so much to the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club for letting me use this photo in the book. All right, I'll get off my soapbox for a minute. So the Loring Greenough House remains owned and operated by the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club, which recently dropped the hyphen in the house's official name. In 1999, the house, its interior, and its surrounding lands were collectively designated a Boston landmark, again, at the highest level of significance, at highest level of protections. The property is listed on the National Register. It is used for public and private community events, including wedding lectures, movies, and other gatherings, and for the diverse and vibrant Jamaica Plain community. Of all of the buildings in the book, only 6 are actually landmark designated, and this is one of them. All right, so we're going to go to a building that is not landmark designated, believe it or not, but has already been mentioned once, and it's connected to the Linden Hall, which we've already discussed. So the 21st oldest building in Boston is King's Chapel, which was built around 1715. We're going a little bit out of order, so this is number 21. The Linden Hall and Loring Greenough houses is 23 and 24. So the building you see here was fresh standing when the first 2 buildings that we talked about were being built. So Anglicans were very unpopular amongst Boston's predominantly congregationalist or Puritan residents. So the first King's Chapel, a 1688 wooden structure. This is a conjectural drawing here in the main steeple that you see in the middle. So we're not sure if it really looked like this, but this is the best image we got. This first building was built in an undignified corner of the town's first cemetery, which is now King's Chapel Burial Ground. So one of the things that I think that people don't realize or just assume in downtown Boston is the cemeteries that we have are close to churches. So like King's Chapel Burial Ground is next to King's Chapel. Granary Burial Ground is next to Park Street Church. Copp's Hill is next to sort of the Old North Church, but they actually are independently tied historically to those three churches. They aren't the cemetery for the church at all. They are cemeteries next to the churches. In the case of King's Chapel, the cemetery predates the church. In fact, they had this kind of corner of the cemetery that nobody really wanted to build in because it was a cemetery that they were allowed to build the Anglican church because nobody wanted the Anglican church there. And they're like, well, you can build it, I guess, but you're going to have to build it in the cemetery. And they went ahead and did that. So King's Chapel kind of landed in the cemetery, not the other way around. So while the church is located immediately adjacent to the burial ground, they fundamentally function independently of each other. The original wood church was expanded in 1710. However, it soon outgrew its footprint, requiring the purchase of land from the town of Boston, which owned the surrounding cemetery, and the nearby Boston Latin School, the oldest public school in the country, on the north side of School Street, which is the corner at the intersection with Boylston. I'm sorry, not Boylston. To accommodate the church's expansion, the school would have to be torn down. And there was a great outcry over the tearing down of the church by Bostonians over the planned demolition, which triggered an early discussion in Boston about the separation of church and state. One resident, John Green Esquire, wrote, another poem for today, "A fig for your learning, I tell you the town. To make the church larger, must pull the school down." "Unluckily spoken," replied Mr. Birch. "Then learning, I fear, stops the growth of the church." It's a little tongue-in-cheek kind of snark from an 18th century Boston resident. I have no idea who Master Birch is. I tried really hard to figure it out. If anything, it was just a guy that was involved in the litigation efforts, but not a major figure in town history. So the expansion plans were ultimately successful, and the congregation purchased a plot of land across the street for the new building of the Latin School. The new church was designed by Peter Harrison, who probably also designed the Shirley Eustace House, which is building number 19, and the next one we're going to talk about. His design called for the use of Quincy granite for the exterior walls. Stone buildings were rare in Boston and included the Hancock Manor and a nearby Cook Mansion, which is directly behind old King's Chapel. It's been torn down since. Both the Cook Mansion and Hancock Manor were standing when King's Chapel was constructed, but have since been demolished. Because there were no alternative places for the congregation to worship, the church was built around the original wooden structure, which was later dismantled after the stone church was completed. The original plans included a stone spire, but funding shortages resulted in the boxy front tower that remains unfinished to the present day. Very little of the 1750s interior have changed, excluding the paint, which would have been darker and much more colorful, including pink and peach tones, than the presently mostly white interior. One of the things that we see in most historic buildings is, especially churches, was a kind of whitewashing in the early 20th century when folks were restoring these buildings. It was falsely believed that many of the early colonial interiors were stark and lacking of decoration, mostly because of the Puritan association with a lot of the folks here. The reality was that most interiors of that early time period were painted with a lot of colorful decorations and a lot of basically fake wood textures on a lot of things. And so it would have been a little bit darker, but a lot more colorful on the interiors and not these stark white interiors that you see at, say, Old North and King's Chapel. Still, the building remains one of the finest and most intact examples of Georgian church architecture remaining in the country. The pulpit is one of the few interior elements from the original wooden building, and it dates to 1718, soon after the expansion of the original wooden structure. The exterior of King's Chapel features several wooden elements, including the massive Doric columns, trims, and wooden balustrade. All are painted a grayish brown in imitation of sandstone. During the Revolution, the church sat vacant. In 1785, it became the first Episcopal church in the Western Hemisphere to convert to Unitarianism, and it remains Unitarian today. At present, the church has an active congregation with regular services and sermons. Though it is a National Historic Landmark, it is not a Boston landmark. So a National Historic Landmark is a nationally registered listed property, which is National Register and are listed, that has a national significance. So basically, a National Historic Landmark is a nationally significant National Register building. It's not a Boston landmark automatically. So Boston landmarks have to have above local significance. So ironically, it being a National Historic Landmark means that it has national significance, which means that we could, in theory, landmark designate King's Chapel a Boston landmark. It just hasn't been done yet. One of my biggest arguments in the Landmark Commission is that we really need to landmark the landmarks, because so many times the buildings that become landmarked today and in the future are done in response to demolition. And a lot of what that usually means is that landmarks are being created as a punishment for demolition. And we want to both be able to say that landmarking isn't a punishment, it's an actual designation to recognize significance, but also we need to have made sure that the landmarks, when you look at the list of the landmarks, it actually includes the landmarks of the city of Boston. I just don't think that that's a big request or an obscene thing to do. These are landmark properties, and the list of Boston landmarks should include the Boston landmarks. So the building today is open for tours, and it's of its interior and its crypt, and it regularly hosts concerts and other performances and community events. Regular is a little bit of an asterisk given COVID, but it's getting back to being a regular thing. All right, so we're going to move over to the last building I'm going to talk about tonight, number 19, which was built in the same town as the Linden Hall and Loring Greenough House when they were first built, all together in Roxbury, but today is now in the town of Roxbury, and JP is now a separate entity. So that's the connection. The building that you just saw at King's Chapel and the building here are supposed to have been designed by the same architects. There's not a lot of overlap in the design, but that's historically what's been said about these two properties. So the Shirley Eustace House was built on a small hill overlooking the former South Bay marshes in an area that was once a rural outskirt of Roxbury. In 1746, workers began a 5-year construction process of William Shirley's country mansion during the first of his 2 terms, from 1741 to 1749 and 1753 to 1756, as the governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. This is prior to the Revolution, so he's a royal appointed governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. In 1745, Shirley gained a claim for capturing the Louisbourg fortress in Nova Scotia from the French. In many ways, that it was his capture of the fortress from France that was essentially rewarded with the governorship of Massachusetts by the king. This photo is great. This drawing is great. You can see the Shirley Eustace House on the left side of the image. You can always pick it out because it's got the big cupola on the top. And then on the right, you can see the original Tri-Mountain of Boston with Beacon Hill on the center part, and then the kind of Russian church-looking churches that are sticking up on the right, including one of those, I'm not sure which one, but one of those would have been King's Chapel. Shirley's new home was meant to impress, and it was likely designed by the architect Peter Harrison, who also designed King's Chapel, where Shirley worshipped. That's what we believe the connection was. Basically, he met the architect at church. The home stands on a tall granite basement foundation, extends upwards 2 stories, and has a partially finished attic. Its oak frame is hidden under massive 2-story flattened column-like giant Doric pilasters, and a wooden block-like coins decorate the corner of the structure. A double flight of stairs on the east of the building leads upwards to the bay-facing entrance, which is the right side of the right image here. Facing entrance under a large 3-section Palladian window with a taller central arch. On the western side, which you can see on the left photo, a flight of stairs leads up to the former carriage drive to the land-facing entrance, which is surrounded by more coins and an oversized keystone. The original exterior boards were grooved and painted with sanded paint, there's sand in the paint, to resemble masonry, but around 1800 they were replaced with plain clapboards. The entire structure is capped by an ornate cupola. So basically, this was meant to look like a stone building when it was first built. Like the exterior, the interior was designed to impress the visitor, with an entrance featuring imported marble and a large winding staircase that leads to the second floor. This is a later historic photo. The east side of the house contains a two-story great hall for receptions and state banquets. In the basement, some of Shirley's enslaved people worked in the kitchen and had their living quarters. There may have been other buildings on the property that included the slave quarters of Governor Shirley. Shirley died in the home in 1771, and it passed on to his son-in-law, Aleckheim Hutchinson. During the Revolution, Hutchinson abandoned the property and rebels confiscated it, using it as a hospital and barracks during the siege of Boston. After the war, the house had numerous owners, including James McGee, a captain in the China trade. McGee, with his wife Margaret Elliott, remodeled the property in a new federal style between 1798 and 1808, including enlarging the windows. William Eustis, who was a surgeon during the Revolution, later twice elected governor of Massachusetts, purchased the house in 1819 and lived there with his wife Caroline. This makes the house the only property in Massachusetts that holds both royal and elected governors. After William's death in 1825, Caroline lived a quiet life in the home and supported the abolitionist movement. Dying at the age of 85 in 1865, Caroline was the longest private owner of the property, and she should be credited for much of its historic preservation, given that she was able to maintain the property as a single widow throughout most of her adult life. In 1867, the house was divided into 53 lots, and the house was divided itself into apartments and moved a short distance to its current location to make room for the planned Shirley Street. The first occupant of the relocated building, the House of the Good Shepherd Catholic Convent, took in so-called wayward or fallen women, including unwed mothers and prostitutes, to give them a stable living space and to keep them employed while living and working in the house through domestic service. Approximately 18 women at a time lived in the house. Half of them were nuns and the other half were reforming Magdalines, which were essentially the prostitutes that were living in the property, before the organization moved to a new, larger building on Mission Hill in 1871. After they left, a clergyman lived alone in the house for the rest of the 1870s. I think it's interesting that they went from 18 women to a single priest. I don't know what that means. In 1880s, individual renters arrived, and multiple working-class families occupied the house. So I love this photo. Besides its quality, it actually shows the kids in the neighborhood of Roxbury, many of whom were actually probably living in the house. They're all sitting out on the steps of the front of the building. You can even see on the second story on the far left, a couple of kids looking out the window, and also a couple of local kids along the fence line at the lower part of the image. Just think it's great to have humanity and people represented in these photos too. In the 1880 census shows most of the home's residents had been born in various New England states, while others had been born in Russia, Baden-Baden, an area of Germany, Sweden, and Ireland. By 1900, most of the families living in the home had been born in Massachusetts or Canada and were primarily of Irish ancestry. These families had probably moved to Roxbury as industrial jobs appeared in the surrounding areas. So this was the history of the property as it went from being a governor's mansion to essentially apartments for recently arrived immigrant populations. When the Shirley Eustace House Association was formed and purchased the house in 1913, many of the original interior architectural elements that had been removed were found in storage spaces in the house or in the private home of an architect in Back Bay. These elements have been carefully restored and others have been recreated. Though the building is a National Historic Landmark, the Shirley Eustace House is not a Boston landmark. The Shirley Eustace House's property is maintained as a historic house museum with tours provided during most of the year. So that's the last building we're going to talk about tonight, and I just want to end with kind of a parting thought, which is a quote from a man that was speaking at the Old South Church soon after it was saved, first by the so anyway. We had a great fire in 1872 that nearly burned down most of downtown Boston. It was stopped just outside of Old South. And you can see in this photograph where the fires had gotten very close to Old South and it had been saved by the town residents. This is, sorry about the dog in the background. Soon afterwards, the city of Boston, the congregants decided to leave the church. And at that point, the church was going to be sold and demolished. And there was a rally held at the church that was meant to to help protect it. So I'm a little distracted by the dog, so I'm getting to where I'm getting at. This is what was read by Reverend William H. Murray that I think summarizes historic preservation in Boston. What is it that makes Boston? Do your warehouses make Boston? Do your stores make Boston? Do your miles of wharfage make Boston? Do the white sails of your many ships make Boston? Are these the things that make Boston and are chiefly valuable to it? No. These warehouses, these ships, these mansions, these things of iron and wood and stone are only the body of Boston. They are only the iron nerves along which her interior, unseen vital self communicates her will. They are only the flesh in which she is living. But Boston is that unseen something, that immortal, sublime, invisible spirit that is not in this building or that building, but which buildings suggest and advertise to the public. And here in this building, there is value beyond any material valuation because here Boston has her unseen, invisible, loftiest self suggested and expressed to the public. Take away these expressions of the soul, of the life of Boston, and what, I ask, have you left beyond any other city on the continent? And just as a final last question, just to ponder, should all buildings in this book be saved? So I wanted to give another shout out to Paper Cuts, a local JP bookstore. It's in stock. Please order it from them if you possibly can. But you can also order it from bookshop.org, which will buy it from a local independent bookstore near you if you're not from the local area. You can also purchase it directly from Brandeis, the publisher. Of course, you can get it on Amazon. You can get anything on Amazon. But if you can get it locally, that would be great. So I'm going to stop here and hopefully you guys have some questions and hopefully I can answer them.
Of course there are questions.
I wasn't able to see.
But I selfishly, since I'm the person hosting tonight, I'm going to ask a question of my own.
Great.
So if one wanted to get a landmark for something like Linden Hall, which is surprising to me that it is not a Boston City landmark, but actually maybe not, what's the process to do that?
Sure. There's a couple of ways it can be done. It has to be started officially with the Landmarks Commission through a landmark petition. It's just a form that you fill out that says, this should be a landmark, please consider it a landmark. You need to have 10 registered Boston voters sign it, or you need to have a city councilor sign it, or you need to have the mayor sign it, or you need to have one of the Boston Landmark Commissioners sign it. Which means the easiest way to do it is to have 10 registered voters sign the petition. That gets submitted to the Landmarks Commission, and then the process begins. Most of what happens is the Landmark Commission will review it and decide whether it is potentially significant. And then if it is, then it can become a pending landmark. But what we need is what's called a study report. And the study report can be sometimes 200-300 pages long. It's an incredibly detailed document that goes into the history of the building. But what it really does is it sets a list of what we call the standards and criteria, which basically says, here's what has to stay the same about the building. Here's what has to be restored to the building if you're going to restore it. And here's what you can and can't do with it. And that's usually the kind of huge amount of work that has to go into that is usually the stumbling block where we don't have the staff and the resources to do that. So we have a ton of what's called pending landmarks, which are things that have been submitted as landmarks, have been voted as potentially significant. We just don't have the study report to get them over that finish line. But pending landmarks have to get reviewed quite a bit unless it's in part of a district. So there is some protections that come with pending landmark status, but we have dozens and dozens and dozens of buildings at that stage.
And follow up, if a local historical society could find and pay for that study to be done by somebody who's sort of certified, would that be reasonable to do? Do you think the city would?
Reasonable and even helpful.
Yeah. Good to know. All right. Okay, that's my selfish question off this.
Sure.
There are others. Somebody asked if you could re-show the slide with the back of Linden Hall, that image where they've got maybe the privy.
I'll send you the photograph.
Okay.
I'll send you the chat.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And we're recording this, so we'll put it up on our website so people can go back and look at the images at their leisure. So that one is pretty easy to do. And then another question about Linden Hall: what's involved in moving a building like Linden Hall?
A lot. So it was really commonplace back in the day, surprisingly, to the point where it doesn't get mentioned in the newspaper when a building gets moved, which blows my mind, frankly. Sorry, I found the image. I'm going to post it in the chat right now. Here it comes. You basically have to lift the building up onto cribbing. You have to place it down onto essentially a gigantic sled, and then you roll it on rollers to wherever you're going, pulled by a whole lot of oxen or horses, usually. It's not that different to how it's done today, except instead of being pulled on rollers by horses, it's pulled on a tractor down the road. But essentially, all of that lifting and pinning, that's just done with simple machines that have been around since forever. So that part relatively isn't that hard. But a lot of these buildings, when they move, unfortunately, from an archaeological side of things, we lose that archaeological site associated with the building. And I did a dig at the Shirley Eustace house a few years ago, looking for the original kitchen where the house used to be, because that kitchen was the place where the enslaved people were living and working. And we found in places like Annapolis and St. Mary's City that enslaved people in these buildings would typically create structures and features underneath the floors, representing their West African heritage. And so we wanted to see if we could find some of those things in Roxbury. But when the house was taken off the hill, they took the hill and dumped it into South Bay. So a lot of the filling of South Bay was from that hill. So our site went into South Bay Shopping Center, unfortunately, in the early 1800s. So we lost the archaeological site. It took us a while to realize we had lost the archaeological site because we had found nothing for many feet. And we were like, maybe this is the dirt they put on top of the site. And then we got to the bottom and realized, no, we're in intact glacial soils. The site's gone. So I'm not archaeologically, I'm not a huge fan of moving buildings because we disassociate the house with the site that's there. And then a lot of times we lose the archaeological site to later development.
Oof. Okay. That same person asked a question about if they could get a signed copy of your book somewhere.
Someday, hopefully soon. I'm not doing any public events, or at least not in person, until things open up again. Yeah, I don't have any really good suggestions as to how to go about doing that. I know if you look at the archaeology website for boston.gov, the city's archaeology page, we have a whole list of book events. There's a couple of events that are coming up in October that we are planning to do in person, like walking tours downtown. So if you can get there to those events, I can sign the books there. We are moving our archaeology lab. So I'm currently moving into a trailer, and our trailer is not going to be open to the public because it's a trailer. Believe me, nobody wants to go there right now. So even when we're back to kind of reopened over the next like 5 or 6 months or so, I'm going to be working out of a very small trailer, and there's going to be 6 of us working on top of each other. So we're not inviting the public to that during that kind of transition phase. But by the end of the year, and I say that knowing that that probably means in the next 3 years, we will finish our new archaeology lab and moving back into the lab. And that's going to be in the city's archive building. So you can go into the reading room of the archives and you'll see the archaeology lab. And if I'm there, I'll sign a book. How about that?
That works.
Yeah.
Find him somewhere.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that we're posting anything that you're doing on our social media and in our newsletter so people can track you down, hopefully.
That's good.
Cool. So there's a kind of a meta question here. How likely do you think it is that we could find a house in Boston that's older than the Blake house?
So that building that I told you about, that's actually in a deconstructed state, is said to be from the 1640s or 50s, which would make it older than the Blake house. So we may have already found it. It's just not necessarily in Boston. So I don't know if that quite counts. It was originally built in Dorchester, which means it was originally built in now Boston. So I think it's not, and if we move to 17th century house to Boston, that would also become. I think that it's actually possible. I'm not sure if it would meet the rules that I have, which is basically it can't be the inside of a building, because we have a lot of buildings that have kind of been added to, that it's now like a piece of the frame is from maybe the 1600s. There's one in West Roxbury that's said to be from the 1650s. I didn't include it in the book because I looked at the house, I looked at the history of the building, and I was like, if it's there, it's in the guts of the building, and you can't see any part of that part of the house anymore. And it's really kind of like a reused timber at this point. It's not necessarily the original structure. So that one, if we could really do a lot of research, we might be able to bring that one back. But I don't think it's a really good odds that we're going to find another 17th century home in Boston that just managed to be forgotten about. I would say, I won't never say never, but it's yeah.
Seems unlikely at this point.
Yeah, I think 18th century houses, I think it's highly likely that there's more 18th century houses that we don't realize that are hiding in the North End, not Charlestown, North End for sure, maybe Roxbury, maybe Alston Brighton,
Yeah.
that have just kind of been subtly modified so they don't look as old as they are, but they are actually quite old.
Yeah, we have a couple in JP that people think maybe, but we don't really know. And
yeah,
would
there's
be
a whole bunch around the Arboretum that I've driven by a whole bunch of times. I've done some research on, and I'm like, they're right on the cusp.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a list of buildings that I'm like, these might be older, and I think most of them are in JP. Thanks to you all helping me out from the local historical society too.
No
Yeah.
problem. So, and then you mentioned two buildings in the book that might be torn down in Dorchester. Do you want to speak to what those are?
Sure. So one of them is called the George Haynes House, which is located in Lower Mills. I'll pull up a photograph of it. The other one is the Calvin Bird House, which is on the intersection of Dudley and Wendover Street in the northern part of Dorchester. They're basically located on opposite ends of Dorchester. The George Haynes House looks like this. Oops, where's my camera? There we go. Yeah, you can see it. There you go. It's got an 1830s hat on it. It's located right by the chocolate factory. It's currently slated for condos, and it's been long paused to become condos. So we're not sure if they're still planning on doing condos, but as of last time we've heard, it would be torn down. There is a movement to try to landmark designate that property. It's currently stalled because of the landmark process takes forever. The other one is the Bird House, which I'm trying to find, and I'm not doing a very good job at it. But the Bird House is a challenge right now because it's already gone through the demo delay process. It was not found to be historically significant, and it's currently slated for housing development. And we're in the process of working with the BPDA to just kind of let them know, like, hey, this building is in this book, and do we really want to say that this is okay to happen? Because the next thing we're going to do is say we've lost one of the 50 oldest buildings in the city of Boston. And I'm having a devil of a time finding the darn. Oh, here it is. As a warning, it's probably the least attractive looking building in the book. So there you go.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's the yellow thing behind all the brick.
It's ready for renovation and some love.
It could use a lot of removal of later editions. Let's put it that way. So it's a hard one to love at the moment, but it is approximately from 1790, and it is the top 40 oldest buildings. Yeah. So if we did a future edition, I'm not sure if those two will make it at this point. Yeah.
Okay, let's end on a high note. What building in your book is in the best physical condition for its age?
For its age. Define best. I mean, there's the most authentic condition. So like the Revere House looks a lot like its original 1600s appearance. The Blake House is meant to look like it's 1600s, but it actually looks like 1890s, even though it's because they interpret it in the 1890s. That's almost an impossible question to answer. I think the one that looks the most like it did the day it was first built is probably the Shirley Eustace, although it's moved, so does that count? Are the big ones that people know about, but like even the Faneuil Hall has been expanded, and Revere House has gained a floor, lost a floor. The Blake House has been added to, subtracted. They're all really been, none of them have gone through the time, the 200-300 years unscathed, none of them. And they're all probably on their fourth or fifth cladding and their sixth or seventh roof at least. So they've all been modified because they have to be. Buildings cannot survive untouched. In fact, that's the way to make them fall apart is to not repair them. So yeah, so none of them are quote unquote intact. Many of them have been restored well, I'll say that, but none of them are original in that sense.
Yeah, well, we want buildings to live their history, right? So
Yeah.
we want to show that people don't use a privy still out the back, right? They got a bathroom at some point and an indoor kitchen. Not
It's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Anybody asks me if I want to go back in time, it's like, hell no, it's awful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I loved your point about Linden Hall, that it's actually been used for its original purpose and people are living there who maybe don't even know they're in their buildings in the book. But great. Well, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thank you, Joe, for a lovely and really entertaining talk. This will be posted, as I said, on our website, and you can catch Joe at other events, and he will talk about different buildings in the book. And then you have to, of course, go out and buy the book and then track down Joe and get him to sign it somewhere. Cool. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you, Joe, again for this wonderful talk. And we'll see you at a future event or at a future one of Joe's events. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Bye.